Hi there, my name is Grandma Betty, and welcome to Grandma Betty's Recipes, where we dig up the cooking wisdom that most people threw out with their grandmother's cast iron. Before fancy stand mixers, silicone baking mats, and $17 vanilla extract took over American kitchens, there was another kind of baker. The kind who worked with cracked bowls, wood-fired stoves, and whatever happened to be left in the pantry on a Thursday afternoon.
These were the hill country grandmothers, the Appalachian aunts, the rural mothers who somehow pulled golden loaves and tender biscuits out of nearly nothing. Their tricks weren't taught in cooking schools. They were whispered across back porches, scribbled in the margins of church cookbooks, and passed down through flour-dusted hands. 30 of those tricks are about to change the way you bake forever. Trick number 1, mayonnaise instead of eggs and oil in cake. If you had told a 1940 housewife that mayonnaise belonged in cake batter, she would not have batted a single eye, because she already knew. Mayonnaise is made from eggs and oil. That's basically the whole ingredient list for what goes into most cake batters anyway. Hill country bakers figured this out when eggs were precious and oil was rationed, and they discovered that substituting a heaping spoonful of mayonnaise for each egg produced a cake that was actually moister and richer than the original. The fat content in the mayo coats the flour proteins in a way that creates an impossibly tender crumb. Duke's was the preferred brand in the South. And if you know, you know. Modern bakers stumble across this trick and act like they invented something revolutionary. Honey, your great-grandmother was doing this in 1932. Trick number 2, vinegar and baking soda as a leavening replacement.
When baking powder ran out and there was no trip to the store coming anytime soon, hill country women reached for two things that were almost always on hand: white vinegar and baking soda. Combine these two in a batter and they create an immediate chemical reaction, releasing carbon dioxide bubbles that lift your baked goods just like commercial baking powder would.
The ratio that worked for generations was a quarter teaspoon of baking soda combined with half a teaspoon of white vinegar for every teaspoon of baking powder the recipe called for. Work fast once you mix them, because the reaction starts immediately and you want all those bubbles inside your batter, not evaporating into the air above your mixing bowl. This trick kept biscuits rising and cornbread light through decades when running to the store simply wasn't an option. Some old-timers swore the vinegar also added a barely perceptible tang that made sweet baked goods taste more interesting. Trick number 3, canned evaporated milk as heavy cream. Heavy cream was a luxury. Canned evaporated milk was a staple. Rural families in the mid-20th century kept canned evaporated milk stacked in their pantries, the way modern families keep protein powder, because it lasted, it was affordable, and it did the job. When a recipe called for heavy cream, smart hill country bakers would dilute evaporated milk with an equal part of water for a straight milk substitute, or use it straight from the can when richness was the goal. In custard pies, it created a silkier filling than fresh milk. In bread pudding, it delivered a depth of flavor that felt almost fancy. In pound cake, it gave the batter a richness that belied its humble origins. That little yellow and red can sitting in the back of Grandma's pantry wasn't a backup plan. Trick number 4, lard over butter for flakier pie crust. This one starts a war at every baking forum on the internet, and I am here to tell you that the hill country grandmothers won that war 100 years before the internet existed. The reason comes down to fat composition. Lard has a higher fat content and a different melting point than butter. which means it stays solid longer during the mixing process, creating those distinct pockets of fat that produce the flaky layers everyone wants. Appalachian pie makers used lard, not because they didn't have butter, but because they'd learned through experience that lard delivered results butter simply couldn't match. The crust that pulls apart in thin, crackly sheets when you break it, the bottom crust that stays crisp even under a wet filling. That was lard's doing. If your pie crust has been giving you trouble, this is probably why. Trick number 5. Instant potato flakes in bread dough. Now here's one that sounds absolutely unhinged until you try it. Adding a handful of instant potato flakes to your bread dough produces a loaf that stays soft and moist for days longer. Rural bakers discovered this almost by accident when they started adding leftover mashed potato to bread dough as a way of stretching ingredients and reducing waste.
The starch in the potato interferes with the gluten structure in a way that keeps moisture locked inside the finished loaf. Instant potato flakes became popular in rural kitchens through the 1950s and 60s precisely because they delivered the same benefit with less effort and no leftover potato required. About a quarter cup of flakes stirred into your dry ingredients is all it takes. Your sandwich bread will thank you on day 4 when it's still soft enough to eat without toasting.
Trick number 6, cold water, ice cube. Trick for biscuit dough. Here is the single most important thing I can tell you about biscuit making, and I want you to write it on a sticky note and put it on your refrigerator. Hill country biscuit makers knew this in their bones. They'd work fast, keep their hands off the dough as much as possible, and use water. Some of them literally dropped an ice cube or 2 into their measuring cup of water before adding it to the dough. Why? Because warmth develops gluten and melts the fat. And both of those things give you tough, flat biscuits instead of tall, tender, pull-apart ones. When that cold fat hits the heat of the oven, it creates steam that lifts the layers apart. Keep your dough cold from start to finish, and you'll never make a bad biscuit again. Trick number 7. Bacon grease for greasing. Pans. Every serious hill country kitchen had a jar of bacon grease sitting near the stove, not hidden in the back of the refrigerator, right there, next to the burners, ready to be used at a moment's notice. And one of its primary jobs was greasing baking pans. Bacon grease doesn't just prevent sticking. It seasons the surface of your pan, contributes a faint savory quality that enhances cornbread and skillet cakes in a way that shortening never could, and it handles high oven heat without burning the way some cooking sprays do. Cornbread baked in a cast iron skillet greased with bacon grease develops a crust on the bottom and sides that is, I am not exaggerating here, one of the finest textures in all of American baking. If you've been throwing your bacon grease away, I want you to sit with that decision for a moment. Trick number 8. Using leftover coffee in chocolate cake. Coffee and chocolate are what food scientists call flavor amplifiers for each other. But hill country bakers weren't reading food science journals in 1945. They just noticed that adding the leftover morning coffee to chocolate cake batter made the chocolate taste more like chocolate. The coffee doesn't make the cake taste like coffee. It deepens and broadens the chocolate flavor in a way that's hard to describe until you taste it. Strong black coffee, even the bitter stuff that's been sitting on the burner since breakfast, works perfectly as a substitute for water or part of the milk in any chocolate cake recipe. This was pure kitchen frugality that accidentally produced his superior baking technique. Today's high-end bakeries charge twice as much for what they call dark chocolate espresso cake. your grandma was making it in a 9 by 13 for a church potluck and calling it chocolate cake.